up, everybody? The Morgile here. Back for another real quick video. This was actually a response to a comment from one of my subscribers, and I thought that there was just a couple of really important points to make, and I wanted to just sort of share this with everyone. So thank you, Miku, for the inspiration. Okay, so this is the original question or comment from Miku. Hi, I was wondering if you could explain why we do not have satellites past the Van Allen radiation belt, or perhaps direct me to any videos you know explaining this. I'm having trouble with a few fellows who are getting increasingly, well, not nice. I would like to have some facts to back up what I know is the truth. Any help would be greatly appreciated. Thank you, Ali, aka Miku. So I'll go ahead and respond to that because it is a good, important point that comes up quite frequently. So to answer the question, and it did take me a while to get back to Miku. I made a video yesterday because all of my private messages and comments that are sort of aggregated in your my channel page, which makes it very convenient, they had all disappeared, and I actually called Jaron. He said they had done the same on his end, but it appears that they reemerged today, so I don't know if I'll take that video down, but I guess I'll just leave it up, whatever. At any rate, it looks like those comments did indeed come back, so I'm glad I was able to respond at least to this one because it is a point that comes up frequently. NASA alleges, or they claim, that there are thousands and thousands of satellites in orbit. And it's not just NASA, it's RASA, it's the Chinese space, whatever they are, Chinese NASA, Chinasa, whatever. But yeah, they claim that there's literally thousands and thousands of satellites up there, ranging in altitude from about 300 or 400 miles up to at least 22,000 miles up, which is geostationary orbit conditions. They claim the highest altitude NASA satellite studying solar wind has its highest point in its orbit at about 470,310 kilometers. So if we convert that to miles, it's about 292,237 miles. So that's what they claim is the highest satellite at its highest point in orbit. Now, 292,000 miles is not just a number we can blow past. If you can think that the equator, the distance around the equator is approximately 25,000 miles. And that would be in the globe Earth model or in the flat Earth model, roughly. So 25,000 miles would be like, if you could drive on a highway all the way around the Earth one time, that would be 25,000 miles. 292,000 miles is 10 times and then some further than that. I guess 11 times and then some further than that. So we're talking about a satellite that is so far away. If you stretched out the equator into end to end to a length of string, it would be 25,000 miles long. We're talking about more than 10 times the distance of that. So that is a great distance. Now, one thing I find hilarious about this so-called highest flying satellite, not only is it the highest flying satellite at 470,000 kilometers or over 290,000 miles, but it is also the lowest flying satellite at the other end of its elliptical orbit or alleged elliptical orbit, coming as low as 186 kilometers or less than 100 miles. Now, this is to me so utterly ridiculous, but that's NASA for you. Now, first of all, radio frequency waves, which are electromagnetic waves. They're a spectrum, a certain frequency of electromagnetic waves. The whole claim is with electromagnetic waves is that or light waves, which are also electromagnetic waves, that they don't need any sort of physical medium to propagate. And This is the case because of the Einsteinian theory of space-time being a vacuum, which went against the Newtonian view of space as sort of an ether or of substance. Einstein threw that out and said that space-time was connected, and that it was sort of a linear fabric, that when massive bodies such as the sun or the earth displace this linear fabric of space-time, it creates a warping effect, and that warping effect is essentially what causes gravity. It's the nothingness of space and time pushing down into, trying to get back to its natural rectilinear state, almost like a surface tension on the globe. But this is, of course, preposterous because the Earth isn't a globe. So at any rate, not to get off on a tangent, the satellites range from 300 miles up. You've got the geostationary satellites at 22,000 miles up, which is roughly, again, roughly the circumference of the Earth at the equator. Or the circumference of the Earth, period. But the circumference of the Earth at the equator in the flat Earth model, it's about 25,000 miles or so. The geostationary condition satellites are at 22,000 miles, and I think traveling at something like 1,700 miles an hour, which is very odd to me. But apparently, allegedly, they range up to, 239,000 miles, which all of these distances are just preposterous. And all of the claims beyond 300 miles are highly doubtful. Specifically, the ISS, the International Space Station, if it actually exists up there as a physical body, at least some of the time. Okay, so it's supposedly about 249 miles up. So this is just below the lower magnetosphere, which is at about 600 kilometers up. That is, the lower magnetosphere is 600 kilometers up. So if we convert kilometers to miles, that's about 372 miles. So allegedly, the ISS, if it actually is up there, it's got a good 120 something mile buffer between it and the lower magnetosphere. Now, the reason that this is so significant is because of the recent discovery last year from Cleo Loy, the undergraduate student at the University of Sydney, who imaged in 3D real-time rendering using the Murchison radio telescope array in a binocular fashion to image these long since theorized and now finally allegedly proven ionized plasma tubes that run meridionally, or they run north to south in the lower magnetosphere. So again, about 600 kilometers up, about 372 miles up. So if the International Space Station actually exists up there, it's supposedly about 300 miles, 240 miles, 249 miles, and this is just below the lower magnetosphere in the thermosphere. And technically, I should say the magnetoplane and the thermoplane to be technically accurate because there is nothing spherical about any of it. However, I will use the common vernacular for ease of understanding. Just note when I say things like thermosphere or troposphere, I'm not talking about any sort of curved thing going around a sphere. We're just talking about different layers of atmosphere that are above the plane. And it works exactly the same. The distances are the same, except instead of having, liquids and gases wrapped around a ball flying through space, you have liquids and gases that are just stacked up on top of each other, sort of like a unshaken vinaigrette or an unshaken yoo-hoo. You have the heavier, denser, materials towards the bottom, and the lighter and lighter materials towards the top. That is the natural order of things. That's what causes hot air balloons to rise. That's what causes helium balloons to rise. That's what causes, 100-ton ships made of steel to float on water. And it's what causes a beach ball to race to the surface of the water when you hold it under. And it's what causes a vinaigrette to go back to its natural layered state once it remains unshaken for a time. Again, these are just the natural laws of density and buoyancy. It has nothing to do with spheres or gravity. It's simply the natural order of things. And I think ultimately We still must have a up and down, and I think that has to do with some form of either electromagnetism or maybe a more exotic form, or maybe another sort of side of that coin that has to do with frequency density, or density as a frequency, meaning higher density objects may be resonating at a higher frequency than lower density objects, and therefore, you've got the heavy dense ground being attractive to heavy dense objects, while helium balloons being of a different harmonic frequency at the molecular level will be, compelled upwards away from that area. It's just, again, following the natural laws of density and buoyancy. Has nothing to do with gravity, has nothing to do with this, planet curving the natural rectilinear state of space-time, causing, space-time to want to sort of snap back to its natural rectilinear state. All of this is theoretical, and in fact, in many ways has been disproven. I'm not going to get into all of that. You can watch many of my videos. Just look for the ones with gravity in the title, and you'll have many reasons why I have totally abandoned the Einsteinian view of gravity. And this is certainly not limited to the Aries failure experiments and the Michelson-Morley experiments. It just has to do with the spinning globe itself being so preposterous. The equator spinning 1,037.5 miles an hour east, while dropping along that curve at 135 miles per hour straight down, standing perpendicular to the axis, which is 4,000 miles away. That's at the equator. Gravity is, very nice and neat to balance us out there. However, if you take that same observer or that same ton of coffee from the equator to the North Pole, where you're standing on top of the axis and not spinning, well, spinning half the speed as the hour hand on a clock, and yet gravity doesn't squash you like a bug somehow, which makes no sense. I mean, there's just one example of why gravity on a spinning globe Earth doesn't make sense. Not to mention there's no curvature and it's not spinning, but I digress. So, there's a recent NASA documentary where a blonde-haired, fresh out of college NASA spokesperson does a documentary sketch, and where he explains that NASA, and I'm paraphrasing here unless I can actually find the clip, is trying to develop technology that will allow us to go beyond the radioactive barriers that lie about 400 or 500 miles up and extend many thousands of miles up to 20 or 25,000 miles up, and possibly even further, which are known as the Van Allen belts.
Even onto Mars. For these missions, Orion has to be one tough spacecraft, withstanding high speeds, searing temperatures, and extreme radiation. Before we can send astronauts into space on Orion, we have to test all of its systems. And there's only one way to know if we got it right. No astronauts will be aboard. The spacecraft is loaded with sensors to record and measure all aspects of the flight in every detail. It all begins with launch, aboard a Delta IV Heavy. The spacecraft and the upper stage begin their first lap around Earth. Mission Control in Houston is monitoring the progress of the flight. Orion's over 100 miles up and going about 17,000 miles per hour. Just as it passes over the Indian Ocean, we lose communication. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. Communication. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. It's great to be a part of this first space flight for Orion, and we're looking forward to beginning a new chapter in human space exploration.
We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
One thing I'll point out real quick is that Orion is not a name of the craft that we should just blow past. In Greek mythology, Orion was a giant huntsman whom Zeus placed among the stars as the constellation of Orion. Again, this is mythology. I'm not saying that someone put the stars in the specific positions to have the constellations. The constellations are obviously a human construct, just to randomly create patterns in the stars so as to, track them as opposed to memorizing all the thousands or billions of stars in the night sky. It's easier to track them in clusters and sort of put familiar shapes or, whatever to them. But anyways, ancient sources tell several different stories about Orion. There are two major versions of his birth and several versions of his death. In Greek literature, he appears first as the great hunter in Homer's epic, The Odyssey, where Odysseus sees his shade in the underworld. The bare bones of his story are told by the Hellenistic and Roman collectors of myths, but there is no extant literary version of his adventures comparable, for example, to that of Jason in Apollonius of Rhodes. So it just goes to show that NASA is still, up to their same old tricks, which is they are indeed into ancient mystery religions. They name all of the craft and missions after, relevant figures in the ancient mystery religions. That includes Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Egyptian mythology, ancient Babylonian mythology, going all the way back to the time of probably Sumeria and all that good stuff. But it's just another one of those hidden in plain sight situations where NASA is blatantly, obviously I guess you could say a Luciferian organization, or at least an esoteric occult organization. Now, up until recently, I think it was either in late 2014 or maybe late 2013, if I'm not mistaken, scientists allegedly discovered yet another radioactive band similar to the Van Allen belts, meaning that the Apollo astronauts would have had to travel an additional 30 or 40,000 miles through this radioactive death trap, and yet they don't remember experiencing anything as they traveled through this. First the ionized plasma in the lower magnetosphere, and then of course all of these different layers of varying radiation, which they had absolutely no account of until many years later when they were put on the spot and suddenly remembered. We've all seen the Bart Sibrel Astronauts Gone Wild thing. So anyway, you've got this blonde-haired, blue-eyed NASA spokesperson saying that they're figuring out technologies to get beyond these radioactive barriers. And of course, this is so ridiculous because NASA claims to have traveled well through and beyond these radioactive barriers onto the moon and back through them, mind you, many times in 1969, never returned. Although Dr. Van Allen had indeed discovered the extended radiation fields up there, NASA ignored his warnings to prepare their mission to expect major issues with radiation. Now, I also think it's funny that the astronauts claim that the Van Allen belts had not been discovered in 1969, when in fact the Van Allen belts had indeed been discovered, and Van Allen was indeed warning them to, have some sort of radiation shielding for the capsule, for their suits, which, they claim to have done for the suits, but not for the capsule, which you could say that's irresponsible of NASA to ignore him and to not equip their capsule for the, prized, precious astronauts. We wouldn't want to have them fried by radiation. But I would argue that the radiation was irrelevant to NASA because NASA never intended to go any higher than low Earth orbit, which is exactly the same thing as high altitude flight. Now, here's the kicker. In 1943, 20 some odd years before the Apollo missions, when Nikola Tesla died, the U.S. federal government seized all his property under the Alien Act during wartime, Although Tesla was from Serbia, he was indeed a naturalized U.S. citizen at the time of his death, and such alien property laws during wartime did not apply to Tesla. Now, the point is, Tesla had created the framework and technology to support all of the following using ground based systems coupled with either geostationary weather balloons or simply bouncing radio frequency waves off of the ionosphere, much like is done using the old school Loran system for navigation across great oceans. And of course, they claim that the newfangled Loran system is satellite based technology. However, that is impossible and irrelevant. The point is, Tesla developed the framework to support internet, including Wi Fi, GPS, including real time tracking of individual transmitters, cellular phones and pagers, wireless communications, including satellite TV and cable TV. Yes, if you have cable, your cable company gets all of their data and all of their channels from a satellite dish. Now, I'm not saying they're coming from a satellite, but they're coming from the natural electromagnetic fields generated by the Earth, which, NASA, who claims to be generating the signals, is just simply piggybacking on the natural electromagnetic fields of the Earth. They're piggybacking their radio waves that way, and I believe they're also possibly bouncing radio waves off of the ionosphere or geostationary weather balloons. Certainly not satellites, but Tesla technology could have supported all of that, wireless communications, anything you can think of in terms of modern telephony or communications or wireless. Even further, he had developed a technology where he could transmit powerful electricity, high voltage electricity wirelessly, so that instead of gassing up a plane with either fossil fuels, and I use the quotes for the fossils, but either running a plane on fossil fuels or possibly water. Yes, the technology has existed since the 60s to run an internal combustion engine on water. It's a simple modification to the carburetor where you simply mix enough oxygen with the water vapor. Everyone knows oxygen is highly combustible, and if you can get that mix right, which is fairly easy to do with injection or just injecting the proper mix of oxygen and water vapor into the combustion chamber, this allows for a combustion equivalent and if not greater than that of so-called fossil fuels, and the only exhaust is water vapor or clouds. And by the way, you don't have to dig up water. You can just find it pretty much anywhere, and there's no energy lost or gained. It's just taking oxygen, combusting it, and instead of O2, the oxygen combines with the hydrogen and you get H2O. If I've got that right, maybe I've got it backward. I'm no specialist in chemical reactions by any means, but I do understand fully well that oxygen is extremely combustible. And as long as you can get that mix right into the combustion chamber, then any normal, regular car can indeed run on water vapor, and that would also include any regular plane, because again, it is an internal combustion engine, although the force generated by the engine, instead of being applied to the wheels in the case of the car, it's applied to the jet engines in the case of the plane. I'm no chemical physicist, but you get the point. The only exhaust is water vapor, and however the combustion works, it has to do with oxygen being the main combustion in the internal combustion engine. And by the way, jet engines and airplane engines are indeed internal combustion engines. Now, I know it is a major point of contention with many people. People love their chemtrails, and I don't deny that there are certain chemtrails. You've got weather seeding, cloud seeding, which uses aluminum. You've got certain chemtrails that are used to magnify or amplify radio frequency waves. for assuming for things like spying on the American public. So there is that. But there's also this other thing, this idea or this fact that a man named Tom Ogle invented a minor modification to the carburetor that would allow any normal internal combustion engine to run on simply water and water vapor. And so, at any rate, moving right along, that sort of got off base with Tesla, but he actually did come up with a way to transmit high voltage electricity that could run jet engines wirelessly. So we haven't seen that yet, but we've certainly seen Tesla technology in use for the last 20 or 30 years for sure. Now, all of that Tesla technology was supported by ground-based, tower-based systems that did not rely on satellites whatsoever. However, geostationary balloons, or simply weather balloons, which indeed remain stationary essentially to the ground below, could have been, and of course they'll drift, but if you've got many of them up there, it doesn't matter as long as you can bounce a signal off of one. That could be part of it. Although the ionosphere acts as an excellent method to bounce radio waves long distance across the plane, not a sphere. And I should also mention that Doppler radar, where the weather forecaster, the meteorologist, shows you what the weather's doing, that's all figured up by ground-based towers. Doppler towers are ground-based. That also is not satellite technology. And in fact, I recently uncovered that, the tornado experts, the guys that try to track tornadoes and warn people to save lives, the best forewarning time they have is about 15 minutes. And if only NASA would share with them their real-time satellite data of the lightning strikes, because there is a correlation when lightning strikes spike up in frequency under certain storm conditions. That's indicative of an upcoming tornado, and they could actually increase the response time or the forewarning time a great deal if only NASA would allow them real-time access to the lightning strikes of the world in real time. Unfortunately, you can watch the ISS live all night long or all day long. It passes through day and night many times over the course of a day, but you'll never ever see one single lightning bolt. And we've watched for hundreds of hours on the Globebusters. I mean, hundreds of hours, and we've never seen one single lightning bolt, nor can you see the street lights or the city lights from the ISS live. However, if you go back in later, once they've had a couple of months to manipulate the footage and archive it and do just straight up CGI, you'll see lightning bolts and street lights, and they say that they applied these filters later, using different cameras, and they have all these long excuses as to why. But in fact, if this technology could help save lives by predicting tornadoes earlier, NASA would have done it a long time ago. So, of course, the same sort of thing could be achieved with weather balloons, but the idea is that satellites supposedly have a much broader spectrum view of the big picture in real time, and so I just think it's a real shame that if NASA is indeed up there with satellites, that they are, sort of keeping the lightning data from the tornado experts, which, by the way, our tax dollars funded NASA, so anything that they come up with, all of their equipment is our property, the people, the United States citizens, the investors, not the private investors, the taxpayers, the big 18 to $20 billion a year ones. That comes from all of our paychecks and our sweat and labor. Anyway, with that being said, satellites are not necessary except for one reason: to convince us that it's terribly difficult and expensive to have cable TV or satellite TV. Yes, the cable companies get their data from a large satellite dish at the main office, so that we'll agree to pay hundreds of dollars per month for our internet, TV, and cell phones, while the technology to support such things were available for free since at least 1943, as developed by Tesla. And even before 1943, I mean, that's when he died, and that's when the United States government seized his property and ostensibly stole all of his inventions and used them to imprison and enslave us. Now, you see, Nikola Tesla wanted all people to benefit from his inventions freely. However, J.P. Morgan and Thomas Edison, ultimately backed by Rothschild, they did not want that to happen. They wanted to ensure that people would pay dearly for technologies that are so very simple and naturally easy to create, while convincing us of this bizarre scientific theory involving the Earth being a spinning sphere with satellites flying around at a gazillion, 1,000 miles an hour, 250,000 miles away, which is ridiculous. But they effectively killed two birds with one stone, so to speak. They monetized free technology that was Tesla based, and they also at the same time tricked us into believing in this infinite space heliocentric model. So it was very effective. That's how they roll. They ain't stupid. Now, all of the fake space missions that might have been shot on the ground involve some real footage of the Earth from high altitudes using a fisheye lens to create the illusion of curvature. However, the horizon is indeed a perfectly straight line, an equidistant circle all around the observer, regardless of altitude. You could be on the top of a ship at sea, and the horizon will be an equidistant circle all around you, which does sort of appear as a curve. When I was young, I went out on a fishing boat out to sea, so there was nothing around but sea, and I got up on top of the 14 or so foot mast, and I could see all around me the horizon, and it does indeed look like a curve, but that's because it's perspective. Your field of view is a finite distance in every direction equally, as long as there's no sort of topography, and so believe you see the curve of the Earth out there on the sea. Now, it could also be 30 miles up, and the horizon level still never falls, as observed by weather balloon footage. But besides that point, there appears to be a limit to, quote, high altitude flight, also known as low Earth orbit, and that would be about 600 kilometers or about 350 miles, give or take. Now, in the mid-1990s, NASA released a surprising report that one of the manned capsules came very close to the 350-mile mark, I believe, and the crew began to experience this radiation. For example, they saw shooting stars with their eyes closed, which would imply radiation passing through their skulls and hitting their retinas, probably coming from the newly discovered, long theorized, and by newly discovered I mean just last year in 2015, but long theorized ionized plasma in the lower magnetosphere. Indeed, undergraduate astrophysicists at the University of Sydney in Australia recently captured 3D animations in real time of the ionized plasma tubes in the lower magnetosphere using the MRI, or the Murchison Radio Telescope Array, in a binocular fashion to achieve a 3D imaging of the plasma tubes in real time. So it appears to me that there is indeed a limit to high altitude flight, also known as low Earth orbit, and any claims that we have satellites 22,000 miles high in geostationary velocities and even 250,000 miles high, all of that is total hogwash. All materials known to man would literally melt and evaporate if exposed to temperatures and radioactive conditions involved with the ionized plasma, not to mention the temperature flux when passing through or passing around the thermosphere or the thermoplane, which would expand and contract all known materials, which would damage any systems critical to the satellite's telemetry, maintenance, etc. So, not to mention, the valves and seals and gaskets that technically can't work in a vacuum environment. Somehow NASA has solved all of these technical, physical problems with, the vacuum of space, yet they aren't letting the American people, the investors, in on this technology because it doesn't exist. Now, at the State of the NASA address, I call him Uncle Ben, but what's his name? Chucky Holden. He claimed that NASA comes out with, I think, something like 1,600 inventions every year. I believe one of the inventions was Teflon, which I've recently learned contains PFOA. a chemical that is a feminizing chemical that attacks the male testosterone levels and sperm count. So good job on Teflon there, NASA. So I guess you're with the Georgia Guidestones trying to decrease the surplus population. Well, just so you know, it's not going to be very long where the theoretical physicists and the astronauts are the surplus population, and probably the politicians and the Federal Reserve and other such entities are indeed the parasitic surplus population, and we the people, the actual workers, the ones whose parents and grandparents fought and died for this country, we are the people, not the Chinese stockholders in the Federal Reserve Bank. They aren't the people. The Federal Reserve Bank is indeed the number one fundamental domestic enemy that has basically enslaved us all with fiat currency and a fractional reserve system that all of us should be extremely pissed about. And really, NASA almost pales in comparison to the Federal Reserve. But at least if we can get started with NASA and the globe, there's going to be other cards that fall, and it's not going to be pretty for the likes of the Federal Reserve. Now, back on point, what we got going on here is a interactive periodic table of the elements, and I'll just go over here to metalloids. Check that out real quick. Metalloid is a chemical element with properties in between, or that are a mixture of those metals and nonmetals. There's neither a standard definition of metalloid nor complete agreement on the elements appropriately classified as such. Despite the lack of specificity, the term remains in use in the literature of chemistry. The 6 commonly recognized metalloids are boron, silicon, germanium, arsenic, antimony, and tellurium. 5 elements are less frequently so classified: carbon, aluminum, selenium, polonium, and astatine. On a standard periodic table, all 11 are in a diagonal area in the P block, extending from a boron in the upper level to the astatine at lower right, along the dividing line between metals and nonmetals shown in some periodic tables. So I just thought that was sort of important to get sort of the definition of how the metalloids appear in the periodic table. So basically what they're trying to explain is Sb and Te, antimony and tellurium, As, Se, selenium. These are all your sort of metalloids included. They're these here. So at any rate, that was just a little background into that. But what you can do with this periodic table is you can look at how different elements react for different temperatures. And it looks like the temperature scale right now is down to, it begins at the low end at 0 Kelvin. So we'll try raising it. And it's color coded so that you can see as temperature is raised, certain things when you're not selecting, when you're raising the temperature, you can see right there towards the left, right here, solid, liquid, gas, unknown. Okay, and so that's it's color coded as to that's how these elements or metalloids are going to react based on the temperature. So just keep that in mind, that solid is obviously what you're going to want if you've got something like a space station. You don't want your space station made of liquid or gas or unknown materials, right? So we definitely want to make sure that under all temperature variants that the space station is going to experience, that the parts, exterior especially, but also interior, because temperature does tend to travel. Hot always goes to cold, and although they will argue that they've got their space station and such very well insulated, I've seen no evidence for that. They never even close a hatch, for crying out loud. So anyways, and oh, by the way, if you watch a documentary about NASA, they were point blank asked what happens if you spring a leak in, say, that window there, and the astronaut answered, well, then you spring a leak. Well, we all know that even the most minor leak in the vacuum of outer space in the thermosphere where the ISS resides would certainly be a catastrophe, an instant catastrophe space station wide because they never close a freaking hatch. But just looking at some of the stuff like aluminum, silicon, um, they also use, I believe, a lot of titanium, or they claim to use a lot of titanium. Notice the element 118 ununcocktium. That's obviously very interesting. But anyway, uh, and then you've got titanium over here, so that's there's a lot of titanium involved with the ISS. Just keep a look at the colors, because again, the colors is what's going on when you see, like right there when I go back and forth, you see the V go back, or the chromium go back from black to blue as I go back and forth through the colors. Well, that means that at this temperature it remains solid, and then at this point, raising temperature, it turns into a liquid. And if you continue to raise the temperature, just like everything else, it'll eventually evaporate or turn into a gas. And again, I'm looking at chromium here, or chrome, and if you continue going to certain temperatures, chrome just remains in a gaseous state all the way up to the top, which is 6,000. And I think it's an important point to make that everything in terms of states of matter, whether it's solid, liquid, or gas, is all related to pressure, temperature, density. All of those are variables, and so even things that you think of as extremely, hard metals, like for example, titanium, which is extremely durable and strong and light and good for building, Limobiles. Um, but even titanium, if heated to the correct temperature, turns into a gas. And so it really just proves the point that if you want to talk about relativity, my definition of relativity would be temperature, density, and pressure. And really, that's what causes the effect of what goes up must come down, which is often attributed to the Einsteinian hypotheses of gravity, involving the world being a spinning globe as the crux or the premise of the entire argument, when indeed the Earth is a stationary plane, so the entire theory is irrelevant. 6,000 Kelvin, 5727 Celsius, 10,000 Fahrenheit. I think that some of the temperature ranges involved with the ISS and the thermosphere, according to astronomy.nmsu.edu, the thermosphere, thermal classification of the atmosphere, and the thermosphere temperature increases with altitude due to the strong incident UV solar flux. It includes the exosphere and part of the ionosphere. On Earth, the temperature rises 1,000 K at 500 kilometers and is isothermal above this level. Just as a little FYI, for those of you who don't know, isothermal, according to dictionary.com, is an adjective which means occurring at constant temperature or pertaining to isotherm, or a noun in meteorology, an isotherm. So, pertaining to an isotherm, we'll follow that link. Meteorology, a line on a weather map or chart connecting points having equal temperature, also called isothermal line. Physics, a curve on which every point represents the same temperature. And without, playing Captain Obvious too much here, I think it's safe to say that there is no curvature of any of these, alleged curves that are in the dictionary.com definition. All of that is assuming that the Earth is a giant sphere, which it obviously isn't. It's a stationary plane. So again, we're just looking at layers upon layers upon layers, not wrapped around any sort of ball whatsoever. So one thing I'll do, just using the known properties of all of these elements, is just see at what point does every last material turn to at least liquid, which is the blue. And that looks like at about 3744 Kelvin. Oh, wait a minute. You still got carbon that hangs on there for a thread. Carbon goes up to about 38 and some odd Kelvin. But up at, beyond 38 and some odd Kelvin, then everything has turned to at least liquid. Most of the things like titanium turn to liquid way back here at about, let's see, 1884 to 1900. So around 1900 Kelvin is where titanium turns to liquid. And, you've got the astronauts on the moon wearing basically, tinfoil layered plastic suits with booties, and the stuff that they were wearing should have melted and probably turned to gas on the conditions they say that are on the moon, unless they made all of their suits out of like carbon, which I don't think they did. I don't think that was the case. And even if that was the case, the temperature flux alone is enough to warp any of these materials from sturdy to brittle, in a matter of certainly years. And with the ISS allegedly being up there for 15 years, it's just a wonder that the thing has never had any sort of incident ever, when they fail to maintain any sort of safety protocols that you would expect. For example, closing a single airlock between segments. They never do. They leave them open for ease of access, it appears, when in fact this would cause the entire, it would put the entire ship in jeopardy. If even the smallest window had the smallest of leaks, the vacuum of space would be so powerful that it would literally begin to suck everything out. First, the atmosphere out of the ISS, and then larger and larger objects would be sucked out. It's because of the pressure differentials. The whole thing would explode fairly quickly.
Rings in here and a shaft that you rotate.
So, I mean, like on the space station, how many of these would you have?
7, because we have 7 windows.
What happens if you get a leak on that?
What happens?
Then you have a leak.
Then you have a
Just
leak.
have a leak.
And what you would do is,
lose air.
yeah, you would probably seal the whole.
Seal the whole company off. How would you do that?
There's probably a plan I don't know off the top of my head. but
There
it's
is a
probably
plan he does not know at the top of his head, but he has been to space several times for years, and he does not know the plan. How can you not know the plan?
placing the.
Operate a lid on the outside of the space station.
This looks really funny, isn't it? This looks really ridiculous. He is a clown.
It's called real good engineering.
Real good engineering. Look at how he said it. Listen.
It's called real good
Real
engineering.
good engineering. That's how he talks to us.
And on top of all that, besides just springing a simple leak, I should add all known materials would be damaged beyond repair, and any systems would have critical failures in these satellites due to temperature flux, radiation, plasma. It's ridiculous to even think that they're up there. So the fact is, there are almost definitely not satellites at least beyond the 300 and 350 mile mark at all, because first of all, they're unnecessary. Second of all, they're impossible. Third, they would be hypothetically completely ineffective to transmit radio frequency waves 22,000 miles, let alone 250,000 miles. Hell, even 400 miles. Radio frequency waves diffuse into the background radiation at much shorter intervals than 400 miles, and it's impossible to transmit radio frequency waves the distances they claim. And it's even funnier because back in 1973, NASA claims to have sent Pioneer 10, a little tin can with antennas on it, all the way to Jupiter. 365 million miles minimum. 90 million miles of that would have been through the asteroid belt, and yet they claim to have sent radio frequency waves with 1970s technology through the vacuum of space, through 90 million miles of asteroids, back to Earth, and people believe this. And I actually did a documentary, well, it was part of a documentary just reviewing NASA's timeline of Pioneer 10's supposed mission, and the timeline makes no sense. So I'm not going to get into the details of that, but definitely check out that video. It's called History of the Fixed Plane, and I'll go ahead and put a link in the description. On the cover, it's got a picture of Jupiter with a little generic rocket launching off of Jupiter, or off of the Earth going towards Jupiter. So finally, that was number 3. Number 4, the exact same effects can be achieved by weather balloons. And I'm talking about satellites. The effects of satellites can be achieved by weather balloons, which the U.S. military was indeed using since at least the early 40s to extend the range of radio waves, and ostensibly for spying purposes. It certainly would give a person an advantage to have a high altitude weather balloon well above enemy territory, that or maybe multiple weather balloons well above enemy territory, that would allow you to triangulate on their radio signals and positions, that would allow you to pick out, high profile, high buzz targets. And my grandfather, he's long since dead and gone for many years now. But when I was younger, he would tell me, his old war stories, and part of that involved weather balloons that they used. He was in the Army Corps of Engineers. At any rate, he did tell me a little bit about that they were using them in the 40s and the 50s. And so this whole idea that you need satellites for GPS is ridiculous. The military has had that technology since before the first satellite was ever launched. And in fact, you can find old footage of the early 1950s when there were 0 satellites, allegedly, where they have things that look exactly like cell phone towers and satellite dishes. So what this tells me, what does it tell you? Should I have to answer this for you, or should I let you think about it for a minute? If the Army had cell phone towers and satellite dishes in 1950, when there were no satellites, what does that tell you? What it tells me is satellite dishes and cell phone towers are not related to satellites orbiting the Earth whatsoever. It tells me that they are tapping in to ground-based, Tesla-based technologies, which are essentially naturally created by the Earth. That was the brilliant thing about Tesla. He understood that the Earth itself was a giant capacitor plate, and that the ionosphere was the other plate to make the connection. And modern globe science still doesn't have an explanation for lightning. They don't. But to me, and I think probably to Tesla, it was obvious that all lightning is the ionosphere grounding out. Makes perfect sense to me. Could be wrong. It's just a theory. But the exact same effects of satellites can be achieved by weather balloons, which the U.S. military was using since at least the early 40s to extend the range of radio waves, to triangulate on radio positions, etc., etc. Now, the truth is, the idea of satellites are so utterly ridiculous, it's extremely confounding to ponder how they ever possibly got away with that lie for so long. The U.S. alien property during wartime, which they used to sort of really just snatch up all of Tesla's work, they picked clean Tesla technology and sold us the idea of space and satellites 20 years later. Because again, they did the whole Tesla seizure in 1943. We had the Apollo missions in 1969, and it seems like that the time in between 1943 and 1969, they started rolling out things like Lost in Space, and all these movies and sci-fi books, and all of this propaganda of infinite space, and space travel and aliens. I mean, it was all a big psyop, provably so. The fact is, we've been using Tesla technology for the last 20 years at least, and the military's been using Tesla technology for the last 60, 70 years at least. But we've been using it for the last 20 years under the guise of satellite technology, so that they, being, the Rockefellers and the government, and possibly the internet service providers and cell providers and such, so that they could justify the total usury and ripoff to pay all these extremely expensive bills. A cell phone bill is $100 a month. A cable bill is a couple $100 a month. An internet bill is $100 and something bucks a month. If you want to have GPS, you're going to pay a little extra. So yeah, they're getting you coming and going with this so-called satellite technology. I'll go ahead and mention that I think it's highly plausible that the internet service providers and the cellular phone providers and the cable providers may not know about this whole fake satellite thing. And in fact, they might actually be pretty PO'd, or, to figure out that NASA and these different space agencies and these companies who are responsible for keeping satellites in orbit and charging big bucks for the companies to support their networks and such, when in fact it turns out that the satellites and all of these expensive allegedly expensive space missions have nothing to do with it, and it actually appears that the satellite signals are coming from naturally occurring electromagnetic pathways generated by the Earth itself, running meridianally, but also radiating east to west. And the whole idea of satellites is irrelevant when the technology has been in place to use geostationary weather balloons or an array of weather balloons in order to bounce communication signals far further than normal. And the curvature of the Earth doesn't appear to be the main hindrance or issue, but instead, the real thickness of the atmosphere towards the ground, as well as, of course, refraction. It just makes a lot of sense to bounce radio communications through the less dense, higher atmospheres as much as possible. And they could also have signal repeaters on such geostationary weather balloons, or even something similar to what's claimed, what they have on these satellites. But the whole point is satellites are physically impossible, technically irrelevant, because the same ends can be achieved by weather balloons, and just a big waste of time and a big waste of money in order to trick us into paying $500 a month for cellular technologies and your cable bill. Add it up. It really does come out to be, for most people with a couple of cell phones, cable, internet, telephone, $400 or $500 a month. So that's a paycheck, to a lot of people. I think it's ridiculous that we could all be tapping into this very same wireless energy grid for free. This wireless energy grid, they claim, that is run by a grid of satellites and is apparently just a naturally occurring grid emanating from the Earth itself, and that may be manipulated or sort of helped along by certain mechanisms, but certainly not satellites, which is in fact Tesla-based, ground-based technology that was intended to benefit mankind freely, but instead has been used to enslave us. And that's a travesty. I think that this needs to change. I think that we, the people, can indeed change this, but we've got to stop this division. We've got to stop this paranoia. The media has created a situation where, it's brother against brother, it's neighbor against neighbor. I remember growing up that it was very common for us to have big block parties and all the neighbors knew each other and everybody sort of got along. And I just remember lots of good times, and anymore, and maybe it's because of the neighborhood that I live in, but in the last 10 or 15 years, I can't remember a neighborhood block party, and maybe there's still some neighborhoods out there that do. But I just, things seem different. It's like if you say hey to your neighbor, half the time they look at you sideways and sort of scurry inside and lock the door. And I really don't think that has so much to do with crime. I think that has to do more with fear, porn, and propaganda. Like Charlie Manson. Hippies were just thought of as sort of, harmless, hippie, pot-smoking dudes, up until Charlie Manson, who I think was a total CIA operative, who at that point turned everybody against hippies. And then you had the whole Timothy Leary thing. He was a CIA operative, by the way, pushing the CIA agenda of getting the entire youth jacked up on LSD so that they couldn't think properly and function. And meanwhile, put through all these laws and did the Vietnam War and set up the framework for the situation that we have today. So thanks a lot, hippies, for getting all jacked up on LSD, because it was the cool thing to tune in, turn on, and drop out, or whatever the hell the little slogan was. But yeah, Timothy Leary, yep, CIA operative. The guy from the Grateful Dead, yep, Jerry Garcia, CIA operative. The Beatles, I'm not so sure, but there was definitely something up with them. They were certainly involved in the whole Illuminati agenda, that's for sure. Sort of gotten off a track, but the fact is we've been using Tesla technology for the last 20 years under the guise of satellite technology, so that they could justify just ripping us off and paying for all of this expensive, satellite technology, which, by the way, our very tax dollars paid to set up in the first place, whether it's satellites or weather balloons or, towers or whatever. We paid for it. That it's our community property. See, that's what a lot of people don't understand. This whole travesty is bass-ackwards. Corporations were originally set up as a public trust to fulfill some public good and to benefit the public. Corporations were never ever intended to become these permanent, festering, cash pits, where they basically suck up everybody's wealth and lower the wages for all, raise the profits for the select few at the top. Corporations were never intended to do that. They were just intended to perform some public good. And as long as they continue to perform some public good and not lose money, and gain money for their stockholders, then that was legitimate. But you've got these CEOs making ridiculous, $50 million bonuses on top of $100 million a year salary, which, this is ridiculous. There's homeless, starving people right here in America. I've heard, and I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I've heard that there are 3 times more foreclosed empty houses than there are homeless people or homeless families in America. So that means all of these foreclosed houses that are sitting there rotting, waiting for savvy investors to flip and banks to own and, re-raise this whole property bubble. Instead of, solving lots and lots of problems by simply housing people, which is what the government should be doing, that should be one of their functions, is to, as sort of a safety net, a critical backup for, the most impoverished Americans. Instead, the government is run by the banks that own these properties that basically foreclosed on everybody in order to bottom out the real estate values and allow for our economy to be picked clean. And it worked. Now, I should mention that this isn't just some crazy conspiracy theory. There's actually precedent for this. If you look back into history at the Great Depression, any historian worth his salt that will actually tell you the truth about what happened was the Great Depression was a pre-planned, controlled sort of demolition of our economy in order to consolidate wealth and power into the hands of a few, instead of the roaring booming 20s. The Great Depression hit, and basically people were all forced out of their homes, left jobless, penniless, homeless, and the so-called Federal Reserve Bank, who was the very cause of the Great Depression in the first place, swooped in to save the day. And we're still stuck with the very issues that were the so-called resolution to the Great Depression by the Federal Reserve Bank, which ultimately put the total control of our monetary supply into the hands of a private group of bankers and investors who are anonymous, which means the Federal Reserve Bank is as federal as the Kitty Cat Prostitution Ranch in Nevada. It's just as federal as McDonald's, and yet they're allowed to control the purse strings of our entire economy, and our government, our elected officials, our representatives, we the people, have to beg and borrow money from people who don't even have the money to begin with. Uh, when did we sign Congress's right to issue its currency over to a group of private banks with no connection to nationalism in terms of America, and their only allegiances are to their own wealth and personal gain? And we just simply allow this to continue because the name of the bank is Federal Reserve. Um, when are people going to wake up to this? This is ridiculous. Their plans are working. And it's the sleeping giant that's totally plugged into the matrix of Fox and MSN that's allowing it to happen. So we need to wake people up. You know, who cares what they think of you? Who cares if they think you're stupid? Start with the Federal Reserve Bank. That's a big one. You know, ask 10 people what do they think of the Federal Reserve Bank. I guarantee you 9, if not 10 of them will say, well, that's where, that's where our money comes from. No. The Federal Reserve Bank is a private bank that invents money out of thin air and loans it to our government at interest, and then loans it to these members FDIC banks who loan it to you at interest. By the way, this money never existed. So you have this private group of people who have the ability to invent cash out of thin air, loan it to you, and then you have to go and work and pay it back. So guess what? You're a slave. The Federal Reserve Bank makes you a slave. They've got to go. They were the reason that JFK was assassinated, I believe. He ran against the Federal Reserve and the CIA, and they had him whacked in broad daylight, in the heart of a big city. So there you go on that. But again, sort of going off topic, the truth is the idea of satellites are really just so utterly ridiculous. I'm just confounded to understand how long they got away with it for so long. And we've definitely been using Tesla-based technology under the guise of satellite technology for the last 20 years. The military's been using it for 75. And again, the point that I had was our tax dollars paid to set all this up, including the military, including NASA and their fakery, which is just a total travesty. Tesla must be rolling in his grave, seriously. So I hope this helps to answer the question of that post, that original post from Miku. Hopefully this helps to, if you want to share this video with your friends that were giving you a hard time. All this research is public domain, so anybody can verify it. Now, a couple things I'll add is the U.S. military is certainly capable of high altitude flight, and I would say even extremely high altitude flight. And if you're familiar with the Vomit Comet, it's sort of like a ride airplane where they take a dozen people into a plane that perform, and it's emptied out of all things, and it's got some padding and stuff, but it performs a parabolic trajectory dive, which simulates weightlessness for, 30 seconds to a minute. Now, if you can do this for a minute with standard civilian technology, I can guarantee you the military has such technology of such a grand proportion that it's highly plausible and very likely that 20 to 30 minutes simulated weightlessness in such a parabolic trajectory is totally possible if the proper velocity and trajectory is achieved. So let's say that they have a 300-mile ceiling to deal with. And I'm not talking about a glass dome in the sky. I'm talking about, the lower magnetosphere with all of this dangerous, ionized plasma and electromagnetic radiation and all that sort of thing. But I could see them going to great velocities at 250 miles up due to the lack of atmosphere and so little resistance to deal with, ergo increasing the craft's terminal velocity. Allowing them to perform one hell of a parabolic trajectory, meaning some of the long-term shots of the, quote, weightless astronauts might be done in some unknown, black-budget, high-altitude flight-capable mammoth, enabling them to perform convincing weightless tricks over extended periods using known technology just on a grander scale. Now, there's no doubt that they've used green screen technology, underwater tanks for spacewalks, and generally CGI. I think it's totally plausible that some of the more convincing, longer-term weightless shots of the ISS could be achieved using some sort of unknown, very large, high-altitude capable craft, which isn't orbiting the Earth in 95% gravity, but is instead performing parabolic maneuvers during super high-altitude flight. Now, keep in mind, they're doing all this on our dime in order to convince us that they're up in space, exploring the vacuum of outer space, doing backflips, playing with water, flicking water all over the inside of the ISS right near power supplies, playing the flute, playing guitars, doing more backflips, faking number one and faking number two, and just, mainly pretending to be in space. And never forget to have that big smile plastered across your face. Now, just notice that they do have a rule of never closing a single hatch between segments, or never closing an airlock between segments, which means that if one tiny small leak sprang in the mammoth and lanky ISS, the entire thing would be an orbiting pile of rubble and the blood and guts of all the astronauts just all over the place in just a single instant, just because they never close a hatch. Now, I suppose having too many extremely heavy iron hatches on the high altitude vehicle would be a bad idea. It'd be too much weight. Now, you'll notice in all ISS footage that the interior stuff appears to be very generic, ultralight, like an airplane bathroom door, for example. And their number one priority, if they actually were up there in the vacuum of space, should be to increasingly fortify the ISS with increasing stability and safety protocols, least of which closing a frickin' airlock hatch once ever. Anyways, thank you so much for your time, your questions, and your comments. I am trying to reply as best as I can. Really quick, if you would like to support this channel and support my efforts, you can contribute directly through PayPal to johnelance@gmail.com, or I do have a fan funding support option right there on my YouTube channel, although that is not preferred. If you don't like PayPal, or if you don't use PayPal for some reason, that option is there. However, Google or YouTube holds those funds for 2 months. They take a big percentage of it, and they use the privilege of fan funding as sort of a punishment mechanism. So, at any rate, enough about that. Thank you guys so much for joining for another another one of my little rant chats. As always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace out.